This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Michael Welk, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 472 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Jordan Morris. Together with Jesse Thorne, he hosts the popular podcast Jordan Jesse Go, and he's also been a writer for TV shows such as Earth to Ned, Unikitty, Good Mythical Morning, and At Midnight. And we'll be speaking with him today about his sci-fi comedy podcast Bubble, which he recently adapted into a graphic novel. And now here's our interview with Jordan Morris. All right, so we're here with Jordan Morris. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Okay, so first of all, I'm just curious, how big of a fantasy and science fiction fan were you growing up?
So I have, I've always been, cramming sci-fi and fantasy into my face hole. I think that, there might be some listeners who might find my taste a little bit basic, but I loved, I love Star Wars and Marvel Comics and DC Comics growing up. Star Trek TNG was on TV constantly, and some of the kind of like alt-year comedy stuff like Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Red Dwarf, the BBC series Red Dwarf was a big one for me at a certain point. I've always kind of loved both sci-fi and comedy and, stuff that mashed it together.
So when you say that some people might find your taste basic, have you had specific experiences where you felt sort of judged for not having obscure enough interests?
Yeah, I think we've probably all had the experience where we meet that person who's a bigger nerd than us. Like there's always a bigger nerd, no matter how much you know about, Justice League International or, Silver Age Batman. There is always someone who knows a little bit more, who's been into it a little bit longer. And I think that's definitely a kind of nerd that's out there in the world is the person who's always quizzing you. And, it's the name 3 albums phenomenon. Like, hey, cool Ramones t-shirt, name 3 albums, and I think we're kind of getting away from that, hopefully, as a culture where, you can be into Spider-Man, whether you like the comics or the movies or the video game or the, free-to-play mobile game. It's all Spider-Man. It's all cool. But I think the quizzy nerd is still out there, and I've definitely met a few in my time.
So, I mean, I assume, you were really into the kind of crossover sci-fi humor stuff, like you mentioned, Red Dwarf and Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Yeah.
How did you come across those?
Good question. I mean, I think that, I think it was just kind of like, I was a real TV kid. So I did a lot of like flipping around, and I also like kind of had trouble sleeping as a kid. So I would like sneak downstairs and turn on the TV when I had trouble falling asleep. And I think that's when a lot of that stuff was starting to kind of like, get on the air. So I definitely remember sneaking down and watching, Mystery Science Theater at, 11:30 with the sound turned way, way, way down. So my parents didn't wake up.
Are there any specific episodes of Mystery Science Theater or Red Dwarf that kind of stick out in your mind?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, and when talking about Mystery Science Theater, I mean, I still put on those classic episodes when I need like comfort, and definitely definitely during the great indoorsing that we all experienced. I'm not alone, I don't think, in doing a lot of like comfort viewing. So like I've definitely pulled out those old DVDs of Mystery Science Theater. So like And I was into maybe my favorite years of that show are the Sci-Fi Network years. So like Final Sacrifice and Space Mutiny, Hobgoblins. Hobgoblins is a wonderful like Gremlins ripoff with the cheapest hand puppets you've ever seen. Those are some of my favorite eps.
So did you have any idea at that time that you might want to like write sci-fi or write comedy or anything like that?
I don't think so. I didn't get the idea that I could be a professional creative person until kind of later in life. I grew up in Southern California, Orange County, but Orange County is about an hour south of LA. So we didn't know anybody in the entertainment industry. I think people assume that, people who grow up in Southern California are, surrounded by showbiz, and totally not the case. I think every adult I knew was like a real estate agent, and I didn't even know any adults who were like creative. I didn't know any like dads who had garage bands or, people that painted and sculpted in, their off time. I just like didn't know any creative grown-ups. So the like idea that a grown-up could be creative as a profession was very abstract to me. I think when I was a kid, maybe thought I was going to be like, a fun English teacher. I mean, I would think when I was really, really little, I wanted to be like a dinosaur bone finder.
Sure. Yeah.
But as I got older, I was like, okay, well, yeah, maybe I would, could be, a cool English teacher or a cool drama teacher. And then when I got to college, I, started doing like sketch and improv, and our college sketch and improv teams would, I went to UC Santa Cruz, which is in Northern California, and we would go into San Francisco and do shows. And sometimes we would like open for bigger sketch and improv groups. And it was interesting meeting like these professional comedy people and who like auditioned and wrote scripts and wrote pilots and, did bit parts on Comedy Central shows. So it was really like, I definitely remember in college, like, meeting creative professionals for the first time and considering that I could be one.
And you met Jesse Thorne in college, right?
I did, yeah. Jesse Thorne, who I do Jordan Jesse Go with, my chat podcast. He was my RA. He was my RA in my college dorm, and then we were both comedy nerds. He is less of a sci-fi nerd than I am, but he is we were definitely both comedy nerds. He had a Kids in the Hall poster, I remember. And, I'm like, this is the guy to be friends with. And, so we started doing comedy stuff together in college. We did like a college radio show that, is pretty similar to the podcast we do now. And, and we did, sketch and improv, and so we met there, and we still work together to this day.
So then what were kind of your first steps in the professional comedy?
So as I mentioned, so in college we were doing those improv groups, and and then Jesse and I were doing college radio, KZSC 88.1 FM, the Heavyweight 88. And, so we were kind of starting to kind of make our own stuff. And then, and then I moved down to LA after I graduated, and then just got, the job that you get when you move to LA. I was a PA, a production assistant. So I was like getting coffee, taking people's cars to the car wash, photocopying scripts, bringing Fran Drescher bagels, that sort of thing. And, and then kind of while I was doing that, after I got off work, I would go, take classes or do shows at places like UCB or IO West, which isn't there anymore. It was an improv theater in Hollywood. So I was kind of like, splitting my time between this kind of boots on the ground showbiz production and, the world of poorly attended improv shows that start at 10 p.m.
Because just looking at your website, it says that you wrote for a bunch of shows, Earth to Ned, Unikitty, Good Mythical Morning, and At Midnight.
Yeah.
So how did you start writing for those shows?
So let's see. So my first gig, my first like non, my first job that didn't include getting bagels for other people was on a TV network that's not around anymore called Fuel TV. And they did like, we would call them extreme sports. They didn't like to say extreme sports. They like to say action sports. So I started out, someone I knew from a sketch comedy group asked me to do a little on-air bit for them. I think it was, this is what I did. So I did a little bit where I went to E3. I went to E3 dressed up like a hobbit. And they asked me to do it because I was the only one these people knew who knew video games. So I knew video games. And they're like, we need a guy to do an E3 bit. So, I did the bit for, $150. And and I think it was kind of a hit, or at least, a relative hit on that channel, which was had poor viewership. But so then I kind of started occasionally doing bits with them, like once a week or twice a week. And I was a PA on Ellen at the time. So I was like, getting stuff for Ellen, getting coffee for the Ellen writers. And then I would go off and do these bits for Fuel TV. And then eventually they asked me to come on staff. So then I got to kind of leave my PA job and be one of the creatives. So that was kind of my first, I have a salary job being creative. And then, and then I was kind of like, after that ended, I was, kind of submitting writing packets and writing samples, trying to get the next job. And and then eventually I started working on At Midnight on Comedy Central because I submitted a couple of packets to them that they liked.
I really liked you linked to a clip from this Unikitty show. It's like a kid's cartoon that you wrote for.
Yeah.
And you wrote an episode called The Delivery Effect, where the characters order food from DoorDash or Grubhub kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, so in the real things, it says, like the restaurant is preparing your meal, the driver is picking up your meal, the driver's on the way, etc. And this is taking so long, and they're getting these messages like the chef is taking a break to call her aunt. The chef is starting that novel she always wanted to write.
Right.
It was really, really funny.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I love that show, and I love that episode in particular. That's like, I don't know, I think that little episode of cartoon is like one of the one of the greatest things I've ever been a part of, honestly.
So did you come up with that while waiting for food, or like how did that?
Yeah. That was just kind of something I noticed when you do that online delivery, is that like time feels like it slows to a halt. And especially if it's like Domino's that has the pizza tracker, like you will just sit there and watch that and get hungrier and hungrier and madder and madder. It's the watched pot that never boils. So that was kind of an exercise in, taking this thing that I think is fairly common and just figuring out what the craziest, cartooniest version of it is.
So were you doing stuff with Jesse Thorne this whole time, or did you guys kind of reconnect at some point there? Yeah.
So Jesse is a year older than I am. So when he graduated, he moved to San Francisco to kind of keep pursuing radio. And then I moved to LA to kind of keep pursuing TV. And then, maybe I had been out here maybe 2.5 years. And then he moved down to LA, and we kind of like started doing our old college radio show as a podcast, which was something I had never heard of before. That was kind of like the start. We had definitely kept in touch and because we're very good friends. So we like kept in touch. But then when he moved down here, we both wanted to keep working together.
Yeah, I mean, because I don't know what year that was, but, I started this podcast in 2010. And for like the first 5 or 6 years I did it, every single time I told someone I had a podcast, I had to explain what a podcast was. It was really like... Yeah.
Right. And people think you need an iPod to get it. Like, can I get it if I don't have an iPod? And then, and I think, around the time we started, like podcasting was just like Mac tips and Harry Potter fan fiction. It was only the like deepest, most niche nerd stuff.
So for people who haven't heard Jordan Jesse Go, do you want to just like, are there any sort of highlights from that show that kind of stick out for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's very like podcast 1.0. We are two straight white guys who dick around and have a guest. It is almost like when people make fun of podcasts, they're describing a version of our show, you know. But yeah, but it's really fun. It is kind of just a free form conversation, and I think we've been really lucky to have such great guests who kind of come on and just dick around with us. Because yeah, I think part of the appeal of the show is that you get to hear these, you know, cool people from the worlds of, you know, comedy and entertainment just dick around and be silly and be stupid, you know, and make, you know, masturbation jokes and stuff like that. So it's you know, it's not someone being interviewed and it's not someone taking themselves seriously. I think that there's a lot of like, you know, podcasts out there where comedians speak very seriously about the craft, and I like those kinds of shows. Like I like to listen to them, but like there's a lot of them. So yeah, I think our show is just like a place where you can hear kind of people like Maria Bamford and Robin Thede and, you know, Kurt Anderson from NPR come on and just act stupid. So I think that like if you want to give Jordan Jesse Go a try, just like kind of go down the list, find, you know, somebody that you like, you've, you know, whose work you like, you know, whether it's Karen Kilgariff for Freddie Wong or somebody like that, and yeah, like just put it on and to know that you're in for a totally contentless, stupid ride.
Well, like it was cool because you mentioned that Charlie Jane Anders was on on your podcast.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, is there anything more to say about how you connected with her?
Oh, you know, that's funny. So Charlie Jane, I randomly picked up All the Birds in the Sky because I just liked the cover, and I saw that John Hodgman, a friend and podcast colleague, had blurbed the book, and I liked the description, and I'm like, oh, Hodgman blurbed this. That's really cool. And so I just kind of randomly picked it up and, you know, read it in 3 sittings because it's awesome. I would imagine maybe your listeners have heard of Charlie Jane Anders in this book, but it's
well, I interviewed her about that book. It was a while ago.
Nice.
But yeah,
great. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a great little blend of like sci-fi and comedy and fantasy, and it all kind of takes place in this, you know, near future San Francisco where magic exists. It's such a great, funny, beautiful book. And yeah, I just after I got done with it, tweeted that I liked it, and then she kind of, you know, slid into my DMs, not in a lascivious way, in a very friendly DM slide, saying that she was doing promo for her upcoming YA book and was looking to book some podcasts. So yeah, that's just kind of how it happened.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this podcast used to be on IO9 when she and Annalie Newitz were running it. So
nice.
She has a real connection to the podcast.
Cool.
But so is that something you do a lot? Just sort of pick up random fantasy and science fiction books and check them out?
I do, yeah. I'm a big like bookstore and comic book store browser. I love to browse. I love to just like pick up a cool cover. I like to read a blurb. I like to like, you know, sit on, you know, the little footstools they have and thumb through a couple of pages. Yeah, I mean, I also like, you know, reading blogs and getting recommendations from friends, but I'm a big browser. I just kind of like, I really like going into a bookstore or a comic book store without an agenda and like kind of letting something speak to me. And I think I've read a lot of great stuff like that.
Yeah. Is there anything that comes to mind that you've read recently?
Oh, you know, I am just, I did that same thing with, have you heard of that series, The Murderbot Chronicles?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Nice. Yeah, I'm doing the first one of that. I just like saw it and I'm like, oh, Murderbot Chronicles. That's a very funny, that's a very funny title for something. And I just like, liked the cover art, and I noticed that it had some good accolades. So yeah, I'm about halfway through the first volume of that, and it's awesome. Really good, really funny, you know, kind of sci-fi about a robot gaining sentience. So kind of a familiar subject matter, but just done in this like very like funny, creative, warm way. And and also recently I got just because it had a great title, I got a graphic novel called Fuck Off Squad. And yeah, that's a very like cool art style, slice of life, you know, kind of YA, you know, dramedy comic that takes place in East LA. And I just kind of like love the title and love the art style. And yeah, I had a great time with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So then, so Bubble, this new graphic novel, it was originally a podcast. So how did the podcast version come about?
Yeah, so Bubble was like, an idea that I had. As I was talking about earlier, I wrote late night for so long, and after At Midnight ended, I really wanted to try scripted stuff. So I needed a sample. So I kind of like was thinking about the kinds of stuff that I like to write, and I'm like, okay, I want to do something that blends genre and comedy, and I kind of had that as just my vague point off in the distance that I was trying to hit, and I around that time I was visiting a friend in Brooklyn. And it was the Brooklyniest part of Brooklyn. Everybody had a crazy mustache, organic coffee, craft cocktails, you name it. And this friend of mine, loved it there, but she lived in a, 3-bedroom apartment with 5 people, and she slept in a walk-in closet. And it was also above a nightclub. It was above this like nightclub that would just like pulse Brazilian house music till 4 a.m. And then I was like, oh boy, does the music get annoying? Does it do that every night? And she's like, no, it doesn't do that every night. It just does it Wednesday through Sunday. So I kind of had this idea of a person who lives in a hip city, but they also have to like fight monsters and robots and zombies. And, when they're going on their morning run, they have to like, kill monsters, but there's a great donut pop up on the way. So that's kind of cool. And, Vampire Weekends playing a secret show. So yeah, I kind of had that idea for just a funny concept. And yeah, I kind of like took that idea and noodled on it for a while, and then kind of added the layers of, maybe they live in an actual bubble. People say, oh, we live in a bubble. We live in a bubble. So I'm like, oh, maybe they live in an actual, Logan's Run type bubble. And then I kind of had the idea for the gig economy aspect. All the characters in Bubble are tied to this kind of life and death Hunger Games gig economy. So, and that was just kind of starting to become something I saw people around me doing, driving for Uber, driving for Postmates, putting together people's furniture on Fiverr. And so I kind of like, took that to its sci-fi extreme. And and then I wrote I kind of wrote a pilot script for it, and to, just to set it apart from other pilot scripts that people get a million of, that executives get a million of. I decided to like do a staged reading and make a little audio recording of the staged reading. And yeah, I put that up on SoundCloud, and our podcast audience really responded to it. Our Jordan Jesse Go podcast audience really responded well to it. And then Max Fun had been wanting to try something scripted. Maximum Fun, our podcasting network, they wanted to try something scripted. So they decided to give it a shot with Bubble. So we made 8 episodes with, a lot of really great, voice talent and writers and directors and editors. And yeah, that was the podcast. And then kind of from there, people started getting in touch about adapting it for other mediums. And First Second, the comic book publisher, got in touch. I know they do the Adventure Zone books with the McElroy family. So they had already had some, success adapting a podcast into a graphic novel. So they wanted to give it a shot with Bubble. And I'm really, really glad they did. I've been a huge fan of their books for a long time, not just the Adventure Zone, but like Battling Boy and all the Jean Luen Yang stuff and all the Mariko Tamaki stuff. So I was a huge just fan of First Second, and in particular the Delilah Dirk books, who the artist Tony Cliff does, who ended up doing the art and adaptation for our books. So yeah, I was just a huge fan of the publisher, and have never said yes to anything faster in my life.
Well, so talk about the world's building a little bit, because so we're on an alien planet, and
Yes.
There's this bubble, and inside the bubble it's kind of like a hipsterish urban environment, and then outside the bubble it's sort of a wild, untamed wilderness.
Right.
And then we're told that Earth is a wreck, it's over. So it sounds like there's some sort of environmental disaster or apocalypse or something on Earth.
Right.
And then all the characters they have exactly are pop culture, like contemporary, like movies and comics and TV shows and everything. So talk about kind of how all those elements kind of fit together.
Yeah. Something I like so much about Marvel Comics is that, it's this insane world of like, superheroes and mutants and gods, but like, they just reference pop culture. They know who Beyonce is. In the world of Marvel Comics, like Spider-Man knows who Beyonce is. And I think that's so great. And I'm always a little bit taken out of genre stuff when they feel like they have to create pop culture that doesn't exist. Like they have to create a version of Beyonce for people to reference. So yeah, that always kind of takes me out of it a little bit. And I think more often than not, it's always kind of corny and eye-rolly. So yeah, I liked the idea of creating a sci-fi story, but all of their pop culture is our pop culture. That's, however this universe developed, it developed with, a lot of the same elements that we have. So yeah, and it's just like more fun to make jokes with things people recognize. So yeah, like they have Postmates, they have Uber, but they also have Hunter, this app for killing monsters. So yeah, I kind of liked the idea of all that stuff existing side by side. That was like one of the things I told the other writers. There were other writers on the podcast, I should mention, a lot of other cool comedy and genre writers. And yeah, that was like one of the directives I gave them, was just like, they know who Beyonce is. Like, don't feel like you have to make up fake stuff for them to be into. Like, let's tell the story and, and just feel like you could use any reference that you want to.
Yeah. Well, actually your co-author, I think, on the graphic novel was Sarah Morgan. And
yes.
in the interview in the back of the book, she mentions BBC radio. She thanks sort of the influence of BBC radio for the blueprints to great audio comedy. And obviously, given the name of this podcast, I'm a big fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Which I was first exposed to in the BBC, radio drama form, right, which I would just listen to over and over and over again. So I was just curious if have you listened to that, or was that any kind of influence on this?
Oh, totally. Absolutely. And yeah, that's definitely something Sarah and I share. She and I share a lot of influences. She's a big MST3K geek. Yeah, so we kind of have a similar sense of humor and similar frames of reference. And yeah, definitely like Hitchhiker's Guide is such a beautiful melding of sci-fi and comedy. The comedy is real. There's a ton of jokes. There's a shit ton of jokes in Hitchhikers, and but the sci-fi is taken seriously. It's not Spaceballs, I like Spaceballs. Like Spaceballs is hilarious, but there's something really special about Hitchhikers in the way it takes all of the sci-fi stuff seriously. That stuff is as considered as it is in, Ender's Game, but the jokes are also taken seriously, and I love that about it. I was also thinking the other day, that's something I love about Bill and Ted. The Bill and Ted movies take their sci-fi so seriously, but it's also just packed with jokes about these goofy stoners from Southern California. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just I don't think I was consciously saying to myself when we did Bubble, let's do a Hitchhikers, but that's kind of what we were doing. So.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we reviewed the Bill and Ted trilogy in a recent episode, and I was saying that in the first movie, when they're like, okay, we're gonna go back in time, steal the keys, and then set up all these booby traps in the police station after the whole thing is over. That's such a good science fiction. That would make an interesting science fiction story, even if it was in a non-comedy
totally.
Story.
Absolutely, you could do a serious, dour sci-fi story about that premise. People, doing a caper and reminding themselves what to go back in time to set up, and it would be great. It's just such a great premise, and yeah, Bill and Ted has so much cool stuff like that.
One thing that was interesting to me in that this is different from Hitchhiker's Guide is that you have a narrator who will say a monster comes up out of the floor or something like that. Yeah. Whereas I don't think there's really, in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's pretty much all just a dialogue with some, the exceptions are kind of separated. So
Yeah.
the characters would be like, you'd have to have a character say like, oh my God, what's that? There's something coming up out of the floor.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you had, like, did you consider either approach, and like, what do you see as the pros and cons of the two different approaches?
Yeah. Yeah. We tried a couple of different things with the Bubble podcast. One thing was making it found audio, like making it characters who are like recording audio of themselves, and it kind of like being a found thing. And that didn't quite feel right. I've listened to other scripted podcasts that use that convention, and they do it great. The Bright Sessions is a great one. It's kind of about what if the X-Men had a therapist. And I think they do found audio really, really well. Welcome to Night Vale, is a radio show from another dimension, and they do a great job of like, the radio spoof part of it. But like, yeah, it didn't quite feel right for Bubble, and the stuff where you're describing what's happening, it just always came off a little jokey the way I was doing it. And maybe it's just my writing style, or maybe I was, I don't know. I don't know why it didn't work. It just kind of didn't. Everything felt a little too winky and a little too like self-aware. And I don't know. I didn't want the comedy to come from like, characters breaking the fourth wall. I wanted it to come from funny characters in a crazy situation. So yeah, it just kind of felt like doing it that way, where someone's like, oh no, he's got a gun, I hope he doesn't, he's pointing it right at us and he's near us, like someone describing what's going on. It just like, I don't know, it always kind of seemed Deadpool-y to me, if that's if that's evocative at all. Yeah, so I just always, just having the narrator to me seemed like the path of least resistance. And I think the narrator has good jokes. The narrator's like funny in the story. So yeah, I think it was like not only a fun way to like, keep the story grounded, but also just a fun joke bucket. So yeah, she was just kind of fun to write for.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I was wondering, listening to this and reading it, is sort of what sort of experiences you've had with book clubs and bar trivia.
Oh, right. Yeah. So two of our main villains in the story, there is Book Club. They are these kind of like wine moms, these like, day drunk wine mom types, people who would buy the, live, laugh, love signs from Target. And they drink this alien gunk and they become a hive mind. So they become a Borg-like collective. And then one of our other villains is the Beard, and it's these kind of like hipster bar trivia dudes, kind of the people we were talking about in the beginning of the show, the people who challenge your nerd knowledge. They're these kind of like, opinionated pop culture dudes who, take all the air out of the room. And yeah, and they get poisoned, and their beards all join to create this kind of, deadly beard monster who just screams bad takes at you. Yeah, so those are two of the monsters. And yeah, that was kind of an exercise I did early on with Bubble, is to kind of like think about the funny types who live in a hipster city, the funny types you meet when you live in Silver Lake or Brooklyn or Portland, and like kind of deciding what the monster versions of them would be. So yeah, I haven't been part of many book clubs myself, but I kind of know the stereotype of the book club who just like, meets to drink and, and talk shit and doesn't really read the book. So, I kind of liked that as a kind of character. So then, kind of let my imagination go to what the monster version of them is. And definitely I have had a lot of personal experience with bar trivia teams who get too serious about it. That is something I have firsthand experience with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I liked the idea of, a aggro bar trivia team becoming a monster. So yeah, it was just kind of an exercise in like noticing the comedy archetypes that were all around me, and, thinking what their, sci-fi analog was.
Well, because when you're talking about these beard characters, the sort of insufferable hipster type characters, I mean, and they'll say stuff like, we need to revisit the Star Wars prequels and things like that. And it's the kind of stuff we would talk about on this podcast. So I'm just curious, like, do you have any advice for people? Like, is there a way to get really into those pop culture things and give your opinions without becoming these sort of insufferable hipster kind of people.
Yeah, I mean, and for the record, I love people who argue for the Star Wars prequels. I don't exactly love them myself, but I think if you can make a considered, and I have heard people make considered and knowledgeable arguments for the prequels, and I like hearing it as long as it's delivered in a respectful way, as long as you're like acknowledging, you're like, this is my opinion, and I realize that different people like different things, but here's my opinion, here's my experience. Yeah, then I like a hot take as long as it's respectfully delivered. I think that a lot of times, and obviously social media has amplified this, for an opinion to break through, it has to be, this is right and all the other ones are wrong, and if you're saying it's the other thing, then you're bad in these ways and it reflects on your character. If you like the whatever, if you like The Last Jedi, it reflects poorly on you as a person. It's those kind of hot takes that people feel like they need to have to get noticed. But yeah, I mean, I am someone who enjoyed the Snyder Cut, and I know that is popular in some circles and it is unpopular in others. And I understand why you would not like the Snyder Cut. It is 4 hours. It is pompous. It is, hard to parse sometimes, but I liked it. I liked that it was a big swing. I liked that it was a very particular vision. But, if someone tells me they hated it, I would like to know, as long as they weren't, calling me a monster while they were doing it. So yeah, I think discussions are fun, and definitely discussing this stuff is so fun. And, we shouldn't take it seriously. Obviously we love it, but like, it's not life and death. People like different things. It's, and it has to, and I think you have to realize that like liking something is personal. It's about like when you discovered it, what the circumstances were, who did you see it with, who did you see the Star Wars prequels with? If you saw it with like, if you saw those movies with like a great friend you don't talk to anymore, like you watch those movies and you're like, God, I remember going to see that at a theater with this cherished friend who is now out of my life, and what are they doing? I should check on them. You have to realize that like people have memories tied to pop culture, and they have emotions tied to pop culture. We don't experience things in a vacuum. So like if someone's telling you what they like or why they like it, like listen to them, be respectful, and like, just make sure that a conversation about pop culture stays fun, because it should be.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've found kind of disheartening recently is it seems to be more and more of a trend that certain movies become these kind of culture war flashpoints. Right. And I feel like I can predict who's going to like a movie and who's not right, based on their politics. And they just become these sort of political, like tribal attestations around pop culture. And I kind of feel like if I know ahead of time who's going to like, if I know what your take on a movie is going to be based on your politics, like what do I really need to listen to your take for,
Of course. Yeah. And I know that this stuff is so loaded these days. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully, we can get to a point where we can kind of watch things and judge for ourselves. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough with, it's tough with social media. It feels like, you're getting 5,000 10 out of 10 opinions rocketed into your face every time you open the app. So yeah, it's a challenge. I can see why sometimes fandoms are not always fun.
Yeah. What do you think about one distinction I've heard between hipsters and geeks is that hipsters sort of say that they like things as part of their public image, and geeks say that they like things sort of ignoring or oblivious to their public image. I was just curious do you have an opinion about that?
Interesting. I mean, I think that the hipster geek Venn diagram overlaps quite a bit. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe the main difference is just that like hipsters' clothes fit better, or fit differently, I guess I should say. Yeah, it's I don't know. I think that these two groups are pretty similar. And I think that, like, whether it's a guy with a handlebar mustache who wants to talk to you about Japanese knives and pour over coffee, or a guy in a Ninja Turtles sweatshirt who wants to talk to you about, why the Ninja Turtles comics are better than the cartoon. These are very similar people. Like, these are very similar people who are just like passionate and into something. And that can be great. Like, I definitely don't, it's fun to kind of make fun of these types, and it's fun to, like, gently noogie these groups. But, like, like, passion is awesome, but it definitely, like, creates some funny, weird characters. And yeah, I think the hipster and the nerd are like, they're, these are not, these are similar people. And they're on the same side of the coin, I think.
Well, let's talk about some of the cast. I think you mentioned John Hodgman, but we've also got, like, just in terms of people who have appeared on this show, you've also got Griffin McElroy and Jonathan Colton. And then you've also got people like Zenny Jardin, Rob Corddry, and interesting Lisa Loeb. I started because there's a sort of a cameo with this kind of like hologram Lisa Loeb, and I was like, wow, that really sounds like Lisa Loeb.
Yeah, it was her.
Yeah. So, like, was it just, are these all just sort of people that you already knew, or was there anyone you're like, oh, I wonder if we can get that person?
Yeah, I mean, basically everybody you hear on Bubble, the podcast, is somebody who's been on Jordan Jesse Go, and we've been doing that show a long time. So we've had a pretty long list of guests, and some of them have gone on to do quite well for themselves. So yeah, it was nice. I think it was like people who were pals who, were fine doing this for, a fraction of what they would make otherwise. Just because it was fun, and they kind of like maximum fun, and they like being a part of it. So yeah, we got really lucky. These were all kind of like personal relationships. And it was awesome. And we got to have such cool people involved. You mentioned a lot of great ones. We also, Judy Greer was in there, Cristela Alonso, Keith Powell from 30 Rock, Mike Mitchell from Love on Netflix, Allison Becker, from Parks and Rec. So I think we're just really lucky to have such a cool, talented group of people who want to goof around with us.
Just on the subject of Lisa Loeb, I'm just curious, have you seen this movie After Midnight, which has like an interesting, like a prominent Lisa Loeb song moment?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you should. This is one of my favorite movies I've seen in the last year.
Okay,
or two.
Yeah, so I'll write it down. It's
sort of like a Richard Linklater romantic kind of mumblecore movie mixed with a horror movie. And it's just really, really cool.
Cool.
So you mentioned that the Bubble and Adventure Zone graphic novels are kind of like, they have a lot in common. And I guess I mentioned Griffin McElroy there, and I'd interviewed him. We talked a lot about the Adventure Zone graphic novel.
Your episode with Griffin was great. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but could you just talk about some of the, some of those crossover kind of things between the two series?
I mean, I think that the thing that they share is like a sense of humor. I think that, like, the McElroys and I are, we're dudes of a certain age who kind of grew up on all this stuff we've been talking about. Star Wars, Marvel Comics, Mystery Science Theater, The Simpsons. So yeah, I think we just kind of have a similar reference bank that we're pulling from. And I think we all share a love of like genre stuff that takes itself seriously, but also jokes, so the fantasy stuff in the Adventure Zone is really well considered. It's a really great fantasy world, and it like has some familiar stuff and it has some new stuff, and it's such a great mishmash of like traditional tropes and pure imagination and kind of parodying familiar stuff you see in fantasy, and also just like delivering a great fantasy story. So yeah, I think that like, I think Bubble and Adventure Zone share a sensibility, even though like one is fantasy and one is sci-fi. They're kind of like, they're marching to a similar beat. And yeah, and they're different projects in a lot of ways. Like obviously the Adventure Zone is adapting a role-playing game. It's adapting a game of D&D. So like, those character arcs and things, they're improvised and they come up kind of like in the moment. And Bubble is a scripted thing, and obviously like the Adventure Zone is great, and that is a like great way to tell a story. But yeah, just ours kind of got created a little bit differently. So yeah, I hope that people who like the Adventure Zone will also like Bubble. I think so. I think that they're like they're related in a good way. I think that they party in a really fun way.
And I don't know if we said this explicitly, but the McElroys play the beard hipster character, and I guess like sort of influenced some of the visual aspects of the graphic novel.
Yeah, so they played the hipster bar trivia team, and and then our artist Tony Cliff kind of used them as the inspiration for the designs in the comic. So it was fun. To go on the record, and I consider this to be the podcast of record. To go on the record, the McElroys are such sweet guys. If you're a fan of theirs, you know that I'm not taking a shot at them for being gatekeeping hipsters, because they are not. They're quite the opposite. But they're just such like fun dudes, and we thought this would be such a fun way to like work with them, and then to just kind of like pay them a little bit of a tribute in the book. So yeah, like we're just huge fans and think that they're great, and definitely this is not a shot across the bow.
One thing I didn't even really notice this reading the graphic novel, but you talked about it in an interview, or maybe the artist Tony Cliff did, but about how Mitch, the character Mitch, all of his T-shirts are failed video games. I thought that was a really funny detail.
Yeah, that was a Tony Cliff design choice. Tony Cliff is like, a brilliant artist, but also a really funny guy. And our character Mitch, he's this kind of like guy who doesn't belong. He is this kind of basic dude who accidentally ended up in the hipster bubble, and he would rather be, eating in a chain restaurant and shopping at a Target, but he just, he ended up in the hipsters, and he's doing his best to belong. And Tony had the funny idea of giving him these like failed video game T-shirts as kind of a signal of him being just out of step a little bit with the rest of the world. And I think it's such a funny little like gag that informs his character.
I really liked the page where he's taken some hallucinogenic drug, and it's all like the panel, or the characters in the dialogue bubbles are all kind of winding around the page. You kind of have to turn the book all around to read everything.
A brilliant Tony Cliff decision that I will take zero credit for. Yes, Tony had this awesome idea that when the character is tripping, you would have to physically spin the book counterclockwise to read the text, so that you're kind of like in his trip with him. And just such a funny, cool idea. The way Tony Cliff plays with like comics conventions is amazing. I've always like loved that about his work, and I'm so glad that he like took the time to have fun like that making Bubble. The fact that he he probably could have just crapped it out, but he really didn't. He really like played in such fun ways with it, and getting those pages back for the first time was amazing. I can't believe some of the stuff he did with this. I'm just like thrilled to have worked with him on this.
Yeah. And then just as I was reading it and as I was listening to the podcast, I was just kind of jotting down some of the science fiction properties that got mentioned. So just a couple of them are Chronicles of Riddick, Game of Thrones, the Solo movie, Black Mirror, and Tales from the Crypt. Are those is it just kind of like random what ends up in there, or do those have any specific interests?
I will be perfectly honest. I don't remember where we mentioned Chronicles of Riddick. That's funny. It's been a while since I've looked at the script. Can you remember that? Where do we mention
I'm pretty sure it was right at the beginning.
That's funny. As I don't know. That is a movie that weirdly lives in my brain. I kind of like those Vin Diesel Riddick movies. Although it could have been a Sarah Morgan line too. I think we each kind of just have weird genre bric-a-brac that lives in our brains. Yeah, and definitely the Black Mirror gag is her. The characters, when something kind of creepy happens with technology, they go, "Whoa, Black Mirror," and yeah, that is all Sarah Morgan. Yeah, so I think that show looms large for her just because she is British and it is a British show. So yeah, that's just a great gag on her part, and definitely when we were writing it, people were just literally saying, "Whoa, Black Mirror," every time, every time Apple would come up with a new, problematic privacy issue. So yeah.
What do you like? What are some of the differences between the podcast and the graphic novel that stick out most in your mind?
Yeah, we really wanted to make sure that it was weird. It's a weird balancing act. It's like we wanted to make sure that people who had heard the podcast could get new stuff by reading the book, but we also wanted them to be able to see, favorite moments and favorite characters. So yeah, we wanted to be conscious that we were adding new stuff, but not taking out stuff that people loved, and also there's just the matter of tonnage, there's so much podcast, and to properly adapt every word of the podcast would take a 600-page graphic novel that would be financially, not financially viable to produce. So yeah, so we kind of had to simplify the story. But also we wanted to add new stuff. We wanted to do new scenes and new characters, and we wanted to make sure there was a more definitive ending. The podcast kind of ends on a really insane cliffhanger that I think none of us had any idea what we were going to do with, but we just kind of thought it was funny and crazy. But yeah, we wanted the book to feel like a story beginning, middle, and an end. We didn't want, we have a little tease at the end for, what the next story might be, but we wanted to feel like, the characters went on a complete journey. So yeah, so we kind of thought about what that journey we wanted them to go on was, how they were going to change over the course of the story. And yeah, and then we kind of just went through and we're like, okay, we got to have book club. We got to have the beard. We want them to leave the bubble at some point. We want them to go into another bubble at some point. And yeah, that's kind of just what we started with. We started with all these pieces and eventually assembled the puzzle. So
yeah, because it felt I listened and read back to back, and it really felt like a lot of the joke. There were a different slate of jokes for the graphic novel.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, yeah, hopefully, I don't know if we got the ratio exactly right, but hopefully, if someone has ingested both products, it feels satisfying. So, yeah.
Have you gotten, what sort of reactions have you gotten? Does anyone want to go, I tattooed Van on my face or anything like that?
Oh, funny. Let's see. No, I haven't seen any bubble tattoos. There were bubble cosplayers at a con. There was a con, I think it was LA Comic Con out here. I met some bubble cosplayers, and that was just a fucking huge moment for me. I'm like, oh my God, people are dressing up like, something I came up with at a con. Huge. I will remember that moment for the rest of my life. Meeting the bubble cosplayers. It's such an amazing moment. Yeah, and I know there was people who were running a bubble D&D game for a while, an in-universe bubble D&D game. That was so cool to hear. I'm not a big D&D guy, but I know that people get so emotionally invested in their D&D games, and to think that people were doing it with our characters was such a cool idea. Yeah, and there's been a lot of great fan art. There's been a lot of, it's always so cool to see people's versions of the characters and the little details they add. So yeah, and that stuff is beautiful. It's some of the most flattered I've ever been in my life is when someone takes stuff from Bubble and reinterprets it or pays tribute to it. It's beautiful. I'm so lucky that I've gotten to experience that.
Yeah, and you did a live episode, right? Or
yeah, there's a live Bubble episode that I think will be either coming out soon or it's already out. I don't know when this exactly drops. This is actually the first time I'm saying it anywhere. It's like, yes, we did a live episode, an in canon live Bubble episode at San Francisco Sketchfest in 2018, and yeah, it's kind of just been like hanging around, and yeah, we thought the graphic novel was a great excuse to release it. So yeah, it's a fun little like dip back into the world of Bubble, the podcast, and yeah, it was totally awesome. I love it. I think it's like a great episode that is on par with the other podcast episodes, and I'm really glad that people are going to get to hear it.
Is it a thing where you're going to hear like the crowd laughing and cheering and stuff during the...
Yeah, I think that our editor is adding some like atmosphere stuff. But yeah, you will be able to hear the crowd and, you know, people serving drinks and stuff like that. It's at a very like traditional comedy club. It's at Cobb's Comedy Club in San Francisco. So, you know, it won't be a totally immersive audio experience, but hopefully it's like a fun bonus.
Yeah. And then what's going on with the animated series?
Yeah, it's a movie actually. So I am writing the Bubble movie for Sony Animation with Matt Tolmack Productions and Point Grey Productions, and yeah, they've been great partners. They're like super passionate about Bubble and totally get it and realize that it's a niche story that you know probably won't make $1 billion, but they just really want to tell it, and yeah, want to tell it you know, in a really like faithful way, I think. Yeah, so I'm writing that movie right now, and it's gonna be cool. It's gonna be really cool. It is it's very different. It's its own thing. But hopefully, like, you know, the characters and the spirit are still there from, you know, the podcast and the graphic novel. But it's cool. It's gonna be insane. It's got some really insane stuff in it, and I'm really excited about it. I think it's really cool.
Is the look of the characters and stuff going to be similar from the graphic novel to the movie, or not? Or is it going to be a different design?
Boy, great question. We're not quite there yet. I think, you know, the idea is that like a director will come on at some point and kind of like, you know, influence the look and the design of it. Yeah, that's kind of like not the step we're at now. So yeah, we're just kind of like trying to make sure the script is right. So yeah, once that happens, then the other stuff can happen. But yeah, I mean, I think Tony's designs are so beautiful, and like Tony, you know, in addition to graphic novels, works in animation, so he knows that world really well. So I think that if like someone wanted to use the graphic novel as, you know, a style guide, I think that would be awesome. But also there's a ton of cool ways to do stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely leave it up to whoever they decide directs it.
All right, cool. I was also just curious, you know, you over email, you mentioned that you know Owen Edgerton, who was a recent guest on the podcast.
Yeah,
I was just curious
Owen.
how you guys know each other.
We are working on an unannounced project together. Owen and I were kind of paired up by a production company to work on something together, because we kind of like share some interests and background details. Yeah, he's such a cool, sweet guy who makes great stuff. I loved his novel Hollow, and yeah, his movie Bloodfest is so funny and cool. Yeah, he's a great dude, and I'm excited to be working with him. He's just been a great partner.
So have you met him in person, or like because of the pandemic and everything?
No, only Zoom. And actually, I'm in LA and he's in Austin. So yeah, we've only Zoomed together. I hope to meet him soon. I hope to meet him someday, sooner rather than later. But yeah, for now, we've only talked on the phone and on Zoom.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys are working up. Because yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed Bubble, and I really enjoyed Hollow and stuff as well. So. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, man. Thanks. Yeah, he's a brilliant dude.
Yeah. All right. So we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any other final thoughts or any other projects that you want to let people know about?
No. This was such a fun, great conversation. Thank you. And yeah, no, I just if you're listening to this and Bubble sounds cool, yeah, head on down to your local indie bookstore or comic book store and pre-order it if it's before July 13th, and if it's after July 13th, yeah, just grab a copy.
All right, great. So yeah, let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Jordan Morris about his new graphic novel, Bubble. So Jordan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jordan Morris for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.